At the heart of every device that is part of daily life, ranging from sleek smartphones that we use to huge flat-screen TVs and vehicles on the street, lies a semiconductor, or in the case of a car, up to 100 semiconductor chips. The technology is a crucial enabler of all things digital, and right now the world is running critically short on supplies due to an unexpected surge of demand for electronic goods throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Without the chips to make their products work, the tech world is being paralyzed, with car manufacturers being the worst affected, halting production of hundreds of thousands of vehicles. How long will the shortage last, and what will the impact be? We discuss this today with Dr. Anup Srivastava, Canada Research Chair of Accounting, Decision-Making and Capital Markets at the University of Calgary. We also have Dr. Arirang, CEO and President of Idea Explorer. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us again. It's always lovely to have you. And, well, let's start with you, Dr. Srivastava, starting with this huge impact on automakers who have been hit the hardest by this semiconductor shortage. Now, Ford is predicting a 20% slump in production, and GM, Tesla, Honda, Audi, VR, these are only just some of the manufacturers that had to temporarily close their factories and slow down their production processes. And IHS Markit predicts that globally there might be 1 million fewer cars this quarter. So overall, looking ahead, how damaging is this going to be for car companies and their growth? And which brands do you think are going to be hit the hardest?
In summary, almost all cars will be affected. All car manufacturers will be affected. So I'm going to answer your question with a series of facts, 5 facts actually. First is that, as you rightly mentioned, cars are increasingly computers on wheels, especially electric vehicles. Almost 20 to 40% cost of a vehicle can be just electronics. The second fact is that car companies do not make those chips. They purchase it from third-party suppliers, such as Taiwanese semiconductors. Now, chips might be important for car manufacturers, but for chip manufacturers, car companies are not important customers. I repeat, car companies are not important customers. Less than 5% of their revenues come from automobiles. The bigger customers are computers and phones and game boxes and so on and so forth. And fourth fact is that car companies keep very small inventory. They follow a just-in-time system. Now, what happened during COVID was car companies faced a slump in demand. So they cut back on orders. Now, once they sort of declined their orders, car companies shifted to more remunerative segments such as phones or gaming systems or computers. Now car companies are facing an upsurge in demand and they need chips, but chip manufacturers have put them back in line. Now there are experts who are talking about at least 6 months before the backlog gets sort of balanced, and the production and car sales will be hit by as much as $60 billion. So in summary, it is not a good situation for car companies.
So these car companies, they really couldn't have anticipated that demand would just slump like that and then surge again. It's been very unpredictable for them. And, well, Dr. Reagan, as our vehicles and our everyday gadgets in general, they become more and more digitalized and keep us connected, how vital is the role of nanotechnology and semiconductor technology for many tech firms to really innovate and survive amongst a lot of competition?
Yeah, I think we see now that there really aren't any dumb devices anymore. Everything is a smart device, and consumers expect that things will be smarter, and including introduction of new types of chips, artificial intelligence, and new sensors, and everything will be digitized and connected. So chips have become more important. Chips have become sort of the differentiator in a product, not just the design, but what it can do. And particularly when we look at cars, for example, it's moving on to the next generation of electric vehicles. And if you look at the amount of chips in an automobile, about 1,500 chips now in an automobile, and they expect that to be doubled, about 3,000 chips in the next generation of electric vehicles. And so you put all that together and you say, well, chips become the major part of any product that is released, and supply chains really haven't changed much to keep up with that.
And Dr. Reagan, well, to really ramp up this supply chain, President Joe Biden, he pledged around $37 billion to cover the short-term costs of rebuilding and securing America's supply of semiconductor chips. Why has it been so hard to quickly ramp up production in the short run, even for major chip makers like Samsung and Taiwan's Semiconductors? How long do you think that these automakers especially are going to have to wait?
Yeah, chips are very complicated. It's a complicated process. Just here in Korea alone, to produce a vehicle, there's about 20,000 different companies involved in that. And so if you look at the chips alone, you have to design the chips. You have to create the factories to produce the chips. You have to have experts doing all of that. And so to be able to do what the U.S. needs to do, and they've sort of abdicated their leadership in producing chips for many years offshore, to create that capacity now inside of America takes a while. It'll take at least about 5 years to create a new chip factory, which is now being done in places like Texas. But it takes time, and it's not just the facilities, it's the know-how, the engineers to produce those. But then we have on top of that the designs and the machines to create those. All that says that now's a good time to start, although they have at least a 5-year horizon before they'll be able to produce new chips. Here in the near term for automobiles, they expect the slump to continue at least through next year, at least through 2022. As mentioned before, the automakers are in the last in line now to get chips, as the chips are being prioritized for more consumer devices.
So, Dr. Srivastav, now automakers clearly suffering very heavily from this. At the same time, this has been quite a boon for some semiconductor companies. How has this supply shortage really benefited firms like Micron? Could this crisis provide an opportunity for them?
Yeah, so they have a different kind of problem. The problem is not of demand. The problem is how to meet the demand. And on top of it, the US government has just announced more incentives. There are some investments that have been announced, some grants, some tax incentives. So it is a good time for chip manufacturers. In fact, let me add one more point to what Dr. Reagan said. In fact, it's not only time. Each fab today, a state-of-the-art fab today, requires $5 billion of investments. Not only $5 billion required, a manufacturing plant is taking a lot of risks. They don't know what technology will prevail 3, 4, 5 years from now. And it's not easy. It's not like ramping up the capacity or adding a few things here or there. The supply increases in chunks. It is not a smooth process. And so on one hand, it's a great time to be in, great time to see this kind of demand. But on the other hand, supply cannot be created instantaneously, nor can it happen without large investments.
So it seems like newcomers to the industry, they're really facing a moving target here. And Dr. Reagan, the US Congress in January, they enacted the Chips for America Act to identify and also mitigate the short-term shortages of semiconductors and encourage more US production by offering some incentives for companies. China has also been aiming to master its own semiconductor technology, although they haven't quite managed to catch up on the high-end chips. And recently, the EU has made known its aim to produce 20% of the world's chips by 2030. So all these countries trying to procure this very important piece of technology. But how steep are the entry barriers to producing semiconductors? And will it be as easy as said to really localize the entire production process and catch up with the likes of Samsung and TSMC, which take up about 70% of the global market right now?
Yeah, if you look at the trajectory of Taiwan and South Korea, they were producing electronics back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and only when it turned to research and development, R&D, beginning in the 90s, would it begin to design those chips. We're talking about decades of history to create the capacity to have that capability to be where they are at right now. If you look at that in terms of European capacity, the US and China, we're talking about a potential decade growth horizon that they have to get the know-how, they have to get the factories, the supply chains. All of that has to be in place, and it's not very easy. Chips today also are very difficult to create because we're talking about very, very small pieces of technology that are being created with new technologies such as light at nanometer scale. And so to be able to do that requires specialized machinery and specialized know-how, and all that has to come together. It's going to be almost a decade-long endeavor for these areas that you mentioned to be able to create that capacity.
And Dr. Reagan, just an additional question here. So in the South Korean context, well, for the last few years, we've seen a very sort of vitriolic trade spat with our neighbor country, Japan. And do you think this is, and of course, Japan, in the form of trade, or they pretty much blocked the export of key components that are used in manufacturing semiconductors, which hit Korean companies pretty hard. Do you think this whole crisis has, in a way, helped South Korean companies get over this crisis and be able to manage more or localize more of its production in going forward?
Yeah, it's interesting that the situation you mentioned with South Korea and Japan, we saw some spats between the U.S. and China. We're starting to see this, what I would say is tech nationalism come to the forefront, where because chips are so important to a country for its own survival, for its economic development, that it's starting to be the case where each country needs to be able to source the components, including the raw materials for chips, has to have the talent, has to have the manufacturing capabilities. All of that has to be inside of its own country, which is sort of defeating what has enabled the industry to grow, which has been a lot of free trade around the world. So it's interesting to see what will happen as we have this competing demand for producing and having a stable source of chips inside of the country versus being able to trade with other countries and having that supply go out of the country. We have a lot more to see on the tech nationalism front, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And we're seeing inklings of governments moving in on this, as with the EU, China, the US, and so on. And well, Dr. Srivastava, before we go, do you see the market dynamics changing from Samsung and TSMC's current market dominance of semiconductors to a more diverse landscape of companies in the long run? What do you think is going to take newcomers to actually become competitive?
Actually, Dr. Reagan has already answered that question, but let me elaborate on that. Let's separate the two parts. The first part is the research part. The second is the manufacturing part. I think in research side, you will see small players emerging from time to time. It's like biotechnology companies. They frequently keep on coming with new discoveries. On the production side, I do not see small companies coming up. And let me explain the reason. The reason is that it requires only a large player can make investments for manufacturing. Just to put it in context, TSMC today has total assets of $100 billion. $100 billion for $50 billion of revenues. So it takes $2 of investments to earn $1 of revenue. And a new fab plant, nanometer plants today require at least $5 billion of investments. Only large companies have that investment power. Second is, only a large company can take the risks required for a new fab plant, because a new fab plant is betting on new technology. When will the 5G be launched? What will be the rollout be? When will autonomous vehicles start appearing on roads? Robotics, AI. So size of investments and risk. And finally, do not forget, this is a very important factor. You need size to negotiate and bargain with your customers. Do not forget your customers are large companies like Apple or Ford or General Motors. They're hard bargainers. They want to leave wafer thin margins on the table and they don't want to keep any inventory. And they cancel orders like they did during COVID times. So how do you bargain with these companies? Only large companies can bargain with them. So in sum, it is very difficult for small players to emerge on the manufacturing side. I do not see a fragmentation of that industry. On the contrary, I only see consolidation on that side.
Oh, it's very interesting. A lot to more to. I'm sure there's a lot more coming from the industry that we really need to unpick in the future. But this is where we must leave the discussion today. That was Dr. Anup Srivastava, Canada Research Chair and Professor at the University of Calgary, and Dr. J.R. Reagan, CEO and President of Idea Explorer. Thank you both so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks, Soya.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.